Good morning, I'm Joe Fryer.
And I'm Savannah Sellers. Right now on Morning News Now, promising prognosis. New this morning, encouraging data at what could be a critical time in the pandemic. Pfizer saying its COVID vaccine booster does protect against the highly mutated Omicron variant, as new cases of the strain are found in more states. We'll break down the study just released this morning and what this could mean for you and your loved ones. Stern warning, a high-stakes call between President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin as concerns grow over Russia's escalation of forces along the Ukrainian border. President Biden promising strong economic and other measures if they invade.
He will do what he says he's going to do in response to Russian actions, so President Putin can count on that.
We'll dig into what the two leaders discussed in the 2-hour virtual meeting and why critics say the president's warning isn't enough. The defense rests after actor Jussie Smallitt wrapped up 2 days of testifying in his own defense, while prosecutors point to evidence that they say shows he staged a hate crime against himself and then lied about it to police. We have the latest developments from court ahead of closing arguments today. And trending down the aisle after nearly 2 years of waiting, lots of couples expected to go big for their big day. We'll give you a look at what experts are expecting, whether you're a bride, groom, or a guest. As a bride, I can confirm it's a little bit difficult.
You got your notebook out, right? You'll be taking notes.
Exactly,
You're like, I've got 20
Just
questions.
Get ready for me to, exactly.
All right.
All right, we'll get to that later in the show. We begin this morning with a better idea, though, of how the coronavirus vaccines hold up against the new Omicron variant.
Yeah, Pfizer is out with new data this morning showing its effectiveness against the strain. Pfizer says its booster shot protects against the Omicron variant, while the initial 2 doses bring down the risks of the variant. This comes as a new study in South Africa shows the Omicron variant significantly reduces antibodies created by the Pfizer vaccine. Now, researchers say that's just one study. It shows the importance of the vaccine and a booster against the Omicron variant. At least 20 states have now reported cases of Omicron, the most recent Illinois and Florida. Despite Omicron spreading, the Delta variant remains dominant nationwide, with more hospitals seeing an uptick in COVID patients, most of them unvaccinated. Let's bring in NBC News medical contributor Dr. Uche Blackstock. So, doctor, what's your big takeaway from this data on Pfizer? I know we're just getting it and looking over it, but if you got Pfizer, how well does it seem you're protected right now?
Right. Good morning, Joe. So one of the concerns with the Omicron variant is that it has a substantial number of mutations in the spike protein that correspond with ability of this variant to evade immunity. So this Pfizer data this morning, although we don't have all the details, is reassuring. Essentially, it's saying that if people are fully vaccinated, meaning they've received the first 2 doses and then they get a booster, that increases the neutralization activity of their antibodies back up to levels that are comparable to being fully vaccinated against the wild type variant. So essentially, the booster can overcome that reduction in neutralization activity. So again, incredibly reassuring. These are small studies. They're in the lab. We know that the immune system is much more complex, containing B cells and T cells and other components. So this is just sort of one piece of the data that we needed to hear this morning.
Bottom line, this is suggesting the booster is pretty important, right?
Incredibly important. And that's why we need to really encourage more Americans to get boosted. We know that there's waning immunity 6 months out from getting boosted with the mRNA vaccines, increases risk of infection. We may see increased breakthrough infections with Omicron variant if people are not boosted. So again, this is telling us that boosters are incredibly important, and it probably eventually will be part of the primary series of being vaccinated against COVID.
Of course, right now, the biggest concern is still the Delta variant. COVID deaths are up 57% from last week. Again, Delta is the dominant variant right now. So what makes it so severe here? Why is it driving up hospitalizations and deaths now, months into when we first saw Delta?
Right. So people still need to realize that Delta is highly, highly transmissible, much more transmissible than the wild type variant, the initial variant that emerged. And so because we're in cold weather, people are spending more time indoors. People were gathered for the Thanksgiving holiday. This is why we're seeing increased cases. And also the fact that only 6 states have indoor mask mandates. Essentially, people have returned to socializing and working as normal, but we still have this highly transmissible variant and spending more time indoors. That is why we are seeing this increase in cases, and it could prove to get worse over the holidays.
And Dr. Blackstock, the U.S. is now investing $400 million in a program to help with global distribution of coronavirus vaccines. Most of the money will go toward bringing the vaccine to remote areas of the world. Quickly on this one, but remind us why this is so important to get these vaccines to areas where we don't live.
Right. So global vaccine equity is a huge issue because it's one of the reasons why we are seeing these emerging variants with different types of mutations. If we don't vaccinate the rest of the world, especially the global south, we'll see more and more variants emerge. So this initiative is incredibly important to getting vaccines to the rest of the world. We know that donating vaccines is just one part of the issue. The other part is really working on infrastructure and logistics on the ground in the countries in the global south to help get vaccinations to each and every person.
Dr. Uche Blackstock, thanks so much for helping us out with this big story this morning.
Now to that 2-hour video call yesterday between President Biden and Russia's Vladimir Putin. There were really no breakthroughs, with both leaders refusing to back down on the issue of Ukraine. President Biden warned of a strong response if Russia attacked Ukraine, and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said the U.S. would be prepared to impose even tougher measures than before. NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba joins us now for more on this. Monica, good morning. So walk us through some of the important takeaways from yesterday's call. Do we know exactly what some of those U.S. measures might be if we were to take it further?
We did learn a little bit more about that, Savannah, and the top line from this 2-hour discussion yesterday, which the White House calls productive, is that the president did warn President Putin that if he were to invade Ukraine, there will be strong and swift measures not seen before, which is a reference to 2014 when Russia last invaded Ukraine and there were economic sanctions. But now the United States is prepared to go further in the event that that happens again, and they are watching it very closely, and they are ready to essentially supply more equipment to partners in the region who also, of course, have been following this and who are poised to act if that does indeed happen. Notably, the White House said they're not sure whether President Putin has made a decision to invade Ukraine, that they're still watching that, but they wouldn't answer whether President Biden directly confronted him and asked him if that was the case. Of course, there were a number of other topics and major angles to all of this, including what might happen with Nord Stream, which is a gas pipeline that Russia has a vested interest in. Here's how Jake Sullivan put that part of the conversation into context.
When it comes to Nord Stream 2, the fact is the gas is not currently flowing through the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which means that it's not operating, which means that it's not leverage for Putin. Indeed, it is a leverage for the West, because if Vladimir Putin wants to see gas flow through that pipeline, he may not want to take the risk of invading Ukraine.
So bottom line, Savannah, again, in terms of whether troops will be sent to the region, remember right now there already are some American forces who are helping as part of a normal rotation. So that's something the White House wants to remind everybody. But it is highly unlikely that you'll see U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine, even if that invasion does take place. But the U.S. said they're ready for any contingencies.
And Monica, what's the Kremlin saying about yesterday's meeting?
So, of course, what was notable yesterday, if we look at the images and the pictures, it was the Kremlin who put out their own video of the video conference call. We didn't get that from the White House. Instead, they only put out a photo. The president was conducting the meeting from the Situation Room. But the Kremlin is saying in a readout that Vladimir Putin warned against shifting the responsibility on Russia, and that Russia is eager to obtain reliable, legally binding guarantees, ruling out the eventuality of NATO's eastward expansion. So what's important there is that Russia has drawn a red line and said they don't want Ukraine to be a part of NATO. It currently isn't, but it might seek membership. And the reason that this is a part of the conversation is because Russia has asked the U.S. to guarantee that Ukraine won't become a part of NATO. And that's not something the president or the National Security Advisor said they would do. They're not going to commit to that. Instead, they're going to say it's up to NATO to decide who joins NATO. And that is still expected to be a long process if and when Ukraine does join the military alliance.
And Monica, quickly before I let you go, at the top of the show, we mentioned that critics are saying that the president's warning to potentially do more isn't enough. Why is that?
Yes, and this is certainly something that we've heard from Republican lawmakers, other critics who have wanted the U.S. president to be tougher on Russia. Remember, this was a follow-up to the high-stakes face-to-face summit they had back in June in Geneva, where it wasn't just issues like this and strategic stability that were main topics of discussion. There's also cybersecurity. There's, of course, Iran, many other topics that we do know they did delve into yesterday. And in terms of what's next, and important to remind people here, Savannah, the president will be speaking with Ukrainian President Zelensky tomorrow after several conversations with European allies in the region about this particular call with Putin yesterday.
Certainly something we'll be watching. Monica Alba at the White House for us. Thank you so much.
New developments this morning in the January 6th investigation. Mark Meadows, former President Trump's chief of staff, is now refusing to cooperate with the congressional probe after he previously agreed to appear for a deposition. NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Vitale joins us now. Ali, good morning to you. So that deposition is still scheduled for later today. What happens if Meadows doesn't show, and what do we know? What's he saying about his decision to stop cooperating?
Well, Joe, all of the lawmakers who were skeptical when Meadows came back to the table a few weeks ago and said he would cooperate with the committee, you can say that they were right, because they were ready to move forward on a contempt referral several weeks ago. They pumped the brakes on that when Meadows said he wanted to come back to the table. And now, in talking with lawmakers on the committee last night, they are ready to push forward on that contempt referral. As for Meadows, this is why he says he stopped cooperating with the committee. Listen.
We found that in spite of our cooperation and sharing documents with them, they had issued, unbeknownst to us and not, without even a courtesy call, issued a subpoena to a third-party carrier trying to get information. And so at this point, we feel like it's best that we just continue to honor the executive privilege, and it looks like the courts are going to have to weigh in on this.
Two things here, Joe. He references those third-party carriers. We know that the committee had sent preservation requests several months ago to telecom companies, social media companies. That's likely what he's talking about there. And when he says that it's going to end up in courts, that's exactly where the former president and his allies have long wanted this to be. Yes, because they think they have a chance where the courts could rule in their favor. That's certainly what's being worked through right now, not just in terms of executive privilege on the National Archives front, but we're also seeing other legal cases work through with people like Steve Bannon on their contempt referrals. But the more places that this ends up in court, the slower the process is going to go. And that's the whole point for Trump and his allies.
You mentioned Steve Bannon, the trial against him. He faces contempt of Congress charges after refusing to cooperate with the committee. That trial is moving ahead. What's the latest with that?
Moving ahead, and probably slower than the January 6th committee wants it to be, and slower than the Department of Justice prosecutors wanted it to be. Bannon's trial in this contempt referral has now been set for next summer in July. So again, they're on the clock, it's ticking, and they need this to move forward quickly, especially because Bannon is still talking on his podcast, having other people on, having them talk about the committee's work. John Eastman, for example, who's supposed to appear for a deposition this week, has been on most recently. So Bannon's still talking about this even as that court case is working its way through.
Nally, sticking with your beat on Capitol Hill, the House was voting well into the night on bills to raise the debt ceiling and fund the military. Quickly on this one, were they able to pass it? And what's next?
They were able to pass both, and they accomplished two different things there. On the defense spending bill, this has been long on the to-do list for this Congress. The same goes for the debt ceiling, but the way that they went about the debt ceiling was to link it with Medicare sequestration cuts, effectively tying it to another issue and passing a new rule so that the Senate could go about this in a simple majority fashion. Here's how Mitch McConnell explained it.
We'll be voting on it Thursday. And I'm confident that this particular procedure, coupled with the avoidance of Medicare cuts, will achieve enough Republican support to clear the 60-vote threshold. And then later, when the majority leader decides to have the procedure, it can all occur in one day, and the actual debt ceiling vote will be done at a 51-vote threshold.
And guys, just to interpret the McConnell TikTok there, what he's saying is that what the House passed last night on the debt ceiling and Medicare, that's a new rule that's going to go over to the Senate this week. They're going to be able to pass that, but they're going to need 10 Republicans to establish this as the procedure going forward. Once those 10 Republicans get on board and President Joe Biden signs this new bill, then the Senate is going to be able to move forward on raising the debt ceiling with just 51 votes. That's going to be all Democrats. It allows Republicans and Democrats both to accomplish what they wanted here. They both have something that they can say that they won on, but no matter what, the debt ceiling gets raised. That's good for everybody. Because remember, we've never defaulted on our debt before.
Ali Vitale, thanks so much.
Closing arguments are set to begin today in the trial of Jussie Smallitt. The former Empire star testified yesterday for a second day, blasting his alleged attackers as liars and denying he staged the racist attack himself. He's charged with 6 counts of felony disorderly conduct for allegedly lying to police, and if convicted, he could spend up to 3 years in prison. For more on this, let's bring in NBC News correspondent Rahema Ellis, who's on the ground in Chicago. We are also joined by Tali Farhadian-Weinstein. She's an NBC News and MSNBC legal analyst. She's also a former New York federal and state prosecutor. Good morning to both of you. Thanks for being with us on this. Rahema, I want to start with you there on the ground. So some of the biggest moments of this trial came when Smallitt himself appeared on the stand twice to testify in his own defense. Tell us about what we learned from that testimony.
Good morning, Savannah. What we heard is some of what you pointed out, and that is Smallitt continued to maintain his innocence as he was peppered by the prosecution about his contact with the alleged attackers. We've got some video we want to show you of Smallitt going into the courtroom with family and friends for the duration of this trial. And on the witness stand, he was asked by the prosecution why he drove around the area with the alleged attackers, even circling the area of the attack. He said it was something that he regularly did, was to drive around with friends and smoking weed. Also, when he was asked questions by the prosecution, he was asked about his contact with the brothers. He said, when asked, why did he give them information about his flight return back to Chicago the night of the alleged attack? He said it was because they had a training session scheduled for later. And Smallitt also went on to say and to testify that he posted information about his flight on his Instagram page because he wanted to keep his followers up to date on what he was what he would be doing that night. So, as you point out, closing arguments expected this morning. There are no cameras and no audio in the courtroom. The judge will charge the jury, and the jury could begin deliberating sometime today. Savannah?
And Rahema, thank you. You just set me up perfectly for this next question for Tali. She was just referencing, Tali, this cross-examination. And something that stuck with me from one of our other NBC News legal analysts that they said about this case, she noted that a big part of this would come down to the cross-examination of Smallitt and the prosecution's ability to point out any inconsistencies. How do you think that went? And were you surprised in the first place to see Smallitt take the stand?
Well, everything about this case is surprising and off book. Smallitt has spent more hours on the stand than he realistically faces in terms of prison time, even if he is convicted. And, if once he made the really unusual decision to go to trial, it made sense that he took the stand because he had a lot to explain away. And he just gave an alternative explanation for lots of the facts that were really hard for him. Why did he cut a $3,500 check to the brothers? Why did he not turn over his phone to the police if he was a victim who wanted the crime against him to be investigated? And I think he did what he had to do to try to tell different stories from the ones that we heard from all of the prosecution's witnesses.
And Rahema, quickly before I let you go, let's talk about some of the other witnesses during this trial, 13 in total. That included those 2 brothers who Smallitt says attacked him. What do we learn about their relationship? And is this going to come down to a he said, they said?
Yeah, it very well might come down to that. Smallitt testified, who was openly gay, testified that he had a sexual encounter with one of the brothers. But on the witness stand, the brother said he did not recall that ever happening. Smallitt also testified that he did give the brothers $3,500, but he said that was for training purposes to help get him in shape for an upcoming music video. And Smallitt had said that his boss had said that he was fat, and so he wanted to do everything he could to get in shape for that music video. He also went on to testify that the brothers told him that if they paid them $1 million each, they would keep quiet about the attack. So, as was mentioned, this may come down to what those 6 men and 6 women believe about who's telling the truth. Savannah?
And Tali, as we mentioned, there were more than a dozen witnesses. One critical piece of evidence, though, is under dispute. There are some private messages between Smallitt and one of his alleged attackers, messages that each side say tell a different story. Obviously, Rahama just laid out quite a bit of that and some of this back and forth. Just how crucial are today's closing arguments, and how challenging will this be for jurors to deliberate with that back and forth?
The closing arguments are particularly important in a case like this where, as we've been talking about, there are two different versions of what these messages mean. For example, when Smallitt wrote to the brothers and said, "I want you to help me with something on the low," what does that mean? And the lawyers are going to obviously interpret those differently. I think the jury is going to move through this really quickly, because, cases like this are usually not even really big enough to go to trial. And there is just not that much to sort through. And I expect that we're going to have a verdict really soon.
All right, Tali and Rahama, thank you so much.
Time to get a check on your morning news now. Weather.
Which means it's time for Bill Cairns to join us. Bill, good morning.
Good morning. Yes, we're watching that storm heading off the East Coast. Remember a couple of days ago, we were like, got a chance for snow, everyone on the East Coast. And now it's kind of like flurries, maybe you'll see a snowflake. Yeah, this storm never really panned out. It's still a storm, but just the timing of it didn't work out. It's really going to get bigger as it goes off the coast. Now, it did bring a little bit of snow to areas in upstate New York. I mean, like this was in Rome, New York, and near Brewerton, New York. So some of the lake effect areas did get some enhancement out of this off Lake Ontario and off of the snow town south of Buffalo. So some people did get the snow, and those are the areas that, you really expect to see the snow. But for everyone else, you may just get a couple flakes, and that includes our friends in D.C., all the way up through Philadelphia. But if you want accumulating snows, you really have to go up into New England. So on this map, remember, the white is the clouds, the blue is the snow, and the green and the yellow is the rain. So you can see it is cold enough that there are some snowflakes falling. It's just so light that we're not going to see really any significant accumulations. Even Boston and Providence, I'd be surprised if you get more than a coating on the grass. Really, from Hartford northwards is the only areas that'll see any accumulation. So for today, still cold from the Great Lakes up through New England, still pretty mild in Texas. And, tomorrow, guys, 80 in Dallas. We're going to talk a lot in the days ahead about the incredible heat wave coming next week. It's going to be like, eye-opening.
Wow.
Let's just put it that way.
Not holiday weather. All right.
Yeah, really.
Thank you, Bill.
All right. See you in a bit.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.